having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims of the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country, and truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. By faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning upon the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the parting of the children of Israel, and gave commandment concerning his bones. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw him as a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, saying to do, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were compassed about 7 days. By faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them, and believed not when she had received the spies in peace. And what shall I say more? What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword out of weakness, were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth. And these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided some better things for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Okay, so, to review, chapter 1, Jesus is superior to the angels. Chapter 2, Jesus is the perfect Son of Man. Chapter 3, Jesus is superior to Moses. And chapter 4, Jesus has provided the rest that was promised where Moses did not. Chapter 5, Jesus is superior to Aaron. Chapter 6 is the warning and encouragement passage. Chapter 7 is on how Melchizedek and the Melchizedekian priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. And then chapters 8 through 10 are about how the new covenant is superior to the old covenant. And so now we come to the chapter that I have been both looking forward to the most and probably dreading the most. It's usually referred to something as like the heroes of the faith or heroes of faith, something like that. It's difficult to talk about these sorts of passages because they involve a lot of material that is usually fairly common knowledge. We're talking about Abraham and Moses. And it's difficult to say something new about something that you've heard 1,000 times. And also it's difficult because there's always the possibility I may something that might conflict with your presuppositions. I make no guarantees either way. So, not only is Hebrew 11 possibly the most famous chapter in the book, it also deals with some very famous characters. And by doing this, we're going to be engaging in some theological dilemma because, we're going to talk about some of these characters' achievements. And there's going to be some theological commentary with it, which doesn't necessarily line up with what we have in the Old Testament, but we'll talk about that as we get to it. Because this chapter, like most chapters, should not be read by itself. So for that, we're going to back up just a little bit, and I'm going to reread Hebrews 10:32 to the end. Remember the earlier days when after you had been enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings? Me neither. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to taunts and afflictions, and at other times you were companions of those who were treated that way. For you sympathize with the prisoners and accepted with joy the confiscation of your possessions, knowing that you yourselves have a better and enduring possession. So don't throw away your confidence, which has a great reward, for you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you may receive what was promised. For yet in a very little while the coming one will come and not delay, but my righteous one will live by faith, and if he draws back, I will have no pleasure in him. But we are not those who draw back, we are destroyed, but those who have faith obtain life. So here we have the introduction of faith, right? He's encouraging everyone to endurance and saying that there are those who fall away. We talked the last time about what that can mean, and he encourages his audience saying, we're not like those because we're the ones who endure, we're the ones who have faith. And now he is going to talk about the significance of faith and what that can mean and go through examples of that. I think perhaps one of the best statements in the New Testament to give context for this sort of thing probably comes from Jesus himself. So, and this is again a very famous verse, everyone should know it. In Matthew 17, Jesus, of course, he tells them, I assure you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will tell this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Sounds like it's raining. So I think that this gives a lot of insight into the significance of Hebrews 11 about the meaning of faith and what can be done with faith. So with that, everything okay? So with that said, we will now begin Hebrews 11. So Hebrews 11 appropriately begins with the statement, now faith. And I'm going to make a bit of a distinction here. He stepped out so I can talk about him. Faith is often paired with the idea of trust. And I think it's helpful or perhaps necessary to make a distinction between faith, especially faith as the author of Hebrews seems to be using it, with trust. So I actually was going to have a chair up here, but I don't need it. The example had been used in the past that when you sit down, you don't always check the chair. You just have faith that it's going to hold you up. I'm not entirely sure that that's the best example of what a faith is, because I'm going to make a distinction that there's trust, and with trust, there's often some measure of guarantee. You trust, so when we come in and we sit in chairs, right? You don't check the chair to see if it's going to hold you up because you have sat in them before. You know what chairs are. You know what they're supposed to do. You've sat in other chairs before. And so you have a logical assumption that because chairs in the past have held you up, there's a reasonable amount of assumption that this one will also hold you up. Now, if it breaks, then that trust is gone, right? Once the trust is broken, it's hard to get it back. And you may be more skeptical next time you sit in a chair. But the point here, and what he's going to build on, is with faith there is no guarantee. Right? You are going out and assuming something that you don't really have a right to assume. And he's going to build on this. So he goes, now faith, and then he continues, is the reality of what is hoped for. My translation says, now faith is the reality of what is hoped for. I'm not entirely sure what they mean by that. I can kind of guess, but reality of what is hoped. That's a really odd way to say it, and other translations aren't necessarily any better. The Greek word here is, now some translations will go with assurance, which might be better, the assurance of what is hoped for. The Greek word is more like foundation. I think what is meant in this statement is more faith is the realization of your hope. So you hope something is going to happen that you may not necessarily know is going to happen, but your faith becomes realized to a certain extent, or your hope becomes realized through your faith. You have faith that's going to happen even if there's no proof or evidence that it will happen. Right? You have faith. You have faith in the hope. And he goes on to continues to clarify this. The proof of what is not seen, which again is an almost ridiculous statement, because proof, and again, I'm going to badmouth this translation a bit, because proof isn't necessarily a good word for this, because proof, especially when we use it in a technical, scientific way, is something that is empirically used as evidence. So, proof is something that's real. I can show you something, and you can see it, and you know that it is real. Whereas here, you don't necessarily have proof. Right? Something is unseen, and yet you are convinced that it is there, or it is real, even if you don't have the empirical evidence of it. Conviction, some translations go with, might be better, the conviction of what is not there, or the conviction of what is unseen. And the idea is faith is what persuades us. It convinces us that what isn't there is actually there. You don't see God, you can't feel God, but you are convinced God is real, right? Because you've given into this idea. And he's gonna build on this. So in verse 2, for our ancestors won God's approval by it, which in my translation it says our ancestors won God's approval. Some translations have a slightly different word, but there's something like maybe they earned God's approval. There's no word in the Greek here for won or earned. It's more literally something like, for our ancestors were commended. It's just different grammatically, and again, there's no word to indicate that they earned it or that they did something for it. It's just they had faith, and because they had faith, there was a commendation. They were approved because of it. So then verse 3. By faith we understand that the universe was created by God's command. Now, he doesn't say, it's interesting where he begins with this. He doesn't begin by saying, by faith we believe that God raised Christ from the dead. Right? He could go there, he could start there. He doesn't say, by faith we believe Moses parted the Red Sea or Abraham did whatever. He goes all the way back to the beginning of time and makes this rather ridiculous claim. By faith we believe God created the universe. This is... there is so much theology in this one statement that it's really even hard to begin where to unpack it. And it's because in the verse, because by faith we understand that the universe was created by God's command, right? He's connecting, we have God, of course, and by faith we assume God is real. And we have God creating the universe. By faith we assume that God created the universe, and all of this is underscored by faith. We have faith in these things. So he doesn't try to argue, which is interesting, as some pastors do, that we know the universe came into existence through some sort of philosophical argument. Most of these came about through the Enlightenment, and we don't need to do a history lesson. But he doesn't appeal to sort of the various arguments, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, the cosmological argument. There are all these arguments. There's no appeal to that. He doesn't appeal to science or evidence or geology or whatever. Now, you may say, James, you deceptively devious devil of doctrine, you're misleading us, because the author of Hebrews wouldn't have access to that information, right? He has to appeal to his less refined arguments. He has faith. He has to appeal to faith because he has nothing else to appeal to. And my response is, I don't think that would change anything. All of these arguments that we have conjured are just contrivances. They're arguments to make us feel better and pretend that we're not going out on a limb and believing something that may not be true. Whereas the author of Hebrews is summarizing it as simply as he can. We have faith that this is true, and that's where everything begins. Not only literally, like the idea that, first of all, that there's God, but that God created the universe, and we have to have faith that these things happened. And that is sort of this first step in our religion, or however you want to phrase it. So we're going to keep going. So in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by God's command, so that what is seen has been made from things that are not visible. Again, so the most fundamental element of our religion, or really any religion, is the assertion that God is, that he exists. And there's no coincidence that Yahweh's name is, that he ties the meaning of his name to the statement, I am that I am. I exist. That's it. I am. God, as a being that we have never met and have no proof exists, is real, right? We're making this assertion. Then the next immediate element is that God did something. God is real, God is, and God did something. He performed something. That which is unseen performed something that is seen. Specifically, in this case, he created the universe from nothing. And of course, this runs contrary to pretty much every religion of his day. They believed that the universe was eternal or that it was made from some cosmic war or whatever. No one outside of the Jewish faith believed that one God, on his own, acting independently of whatever cosmic forces that existed, just spoke the universe into existence. So he's making a statement that even in his own day would have been taken with ridicule. And of course, today, we have made up our own myths. Some say that the universe is eternal. They've been saying that for thousands and thousands of years. Some say that our universe had a fixed point of creation that willed itself into existence. That if you think about for more than 2 seconds, doesn't make any sense. How can anything will itself into existence? I have serious doubts that any, we'll call them scientists, actually believe this, but we still teach this in school, that the universe just, one moment it didn't exist, next moment it did exist, and that's just what we believe. It's absurd, but we teach this. Now, you may ask, what does this mean and how does this affect us in our day-to-day life? Well, the author of Hebrews has examples, right? This is important. This is foundational to the faith. We're making assertions and our faith is making claims that we have to hold to. And again, as we're going to go through them, we're going to talk about some of the theological interpretations he is applying to these examples. So, in verse 4, by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was approved as a righteous man because God approved his gifts. Even though he is dead, he still speaks through his faith. So, this is fun for a couple of reasons. But I'm going to appeal back to what Jesus said in Luke 11. Woe to you! You build monuments to the prophets, and your fathers killed them. Therefore, you're witnesses that you approve the deeds of your fathers, for they killed them, and you build their monuments. Because of this, the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the sanctuary. Now, Jesus is going chronologically, Abel in Genesis, and Zechariah as a post-exilic prophet. It is pure coincidence that their names begin with A to Z. But it's a really funny coincidence, especially in English. It goes from Abel to Zechariah, A to Z. But it's interesting because he calls Abel a prophet, which Abel is never referred to as a prophet in the Old Testament. And it's curious why he does, and there's not a whole lot of background to explain why he does. The best explanation we can come up with is that Abel was following God as best he could and was killed for his obedience to God, thus establishing a precedent that all the prophets, or many of the prophets, kind of follow. They follow God's will, and then they're persecuted for it. So Abel makes sense, even though he's never called a prophet in the Old Testament. And thus, because Abel had faith, and he acted on it, and was persecuted for it, he is being considered or labeled something like a prophet, and as a prophet, he continues to speak to us today, which seems to be how the author of Hebrews is interpreting it. We'll go on to verse 5. By faith, Enoch, we go from Abel to Enoch, which is just fantastic, was taken away so that he did not experience death, and he was not to be found because God took him away. For prior to his removal, he was approved since he had pleased God. Enoch is another very mysterious character in the Bible, with Melchizedek and a few others. He is mentioned very briefly in Genesis 5, so just to read those verses. Enoch was 65 years old when he fathered Methuselah. And after the birth of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and fathered other sons and daughters. So Enoch's life was 365 years. Enoch walked with God, then he was not because God took him. We have no idea what this means. It is incredibly curious, but the New Testament seems to confirm the Jewish tradition that Enoch was just taken by God. He was there and then he wasn't. Similar to, although not exactly the same as Elijah, who was taken up by God. And the idea is that he didn't die. And the author of Hebrews is going to give us a little commentary on what this means, even though we don't have much in the Old Testament to back this up. This is just what he's going to say. So in verse 6, now without faith it is impossible to please God, for the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and rewards those who seek him. This is an interesting argument, and it's perfectly logical. He's basically saying that you have to have faith in God prior to pleasing God. That makes sense. So because Scripture says Enoch pleased God, it logically follows that he must have had faith. So see how the two things kind of they feed into each other. So he had faith, and by faith he was able to please God. He pleased God so much through his faith that God just took him up. That makes sense. Verse 7, by faith Noah, after he was warned about what was not yet seen. Again, author of Hebrews is making a connection between faith and the unknown. That you believe in faith despite not having empirical evidence. And then it continues, and motivated by godly fear. It is difficult to explain why this and other translations have the phrase godly fear, and it would take me a long time to go through the history of it. It's not actually the word. The word in Greek is eulabeia, which basically means reverence, but in the Old Testament there are places where the word fear is translated as eulabeia, and it creates a huge theological conundrum. It's reverence, but there you go. So, motivated by godly fear, built an ark to deliver his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So this is difficult to translate, and I am not going to make a big attempt at it. My understanding is by faith he condemned the world means that he has rejected the world. He has left the world to its damnation and judgment, and in so doing, he left the old world behind and was worthy to start a new one, effectively becoming the new Adam. And as the new Adam, he is now the new heir of creation. And we've already gone over the idea that you had the original Adam who failed at the garden, and then you have this series throughout the Old Testament of new Adams that spring up, only each one in succession fails, ultimately leading to Christ as the final new Adam, the true new Adam. So now with Noah, something is introduced because we know quite a bit about the story of Noah, and Noah starts off really well, but doesn't end very well. And we're going to talk about the significance of that, believe me. So in verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed, and went out to a place he was going to receive as an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he was going. We should all be familiar with most of these stories, especially Abraham. He lived in Ur of the Chaldees. We have no idea where that is. Current theories put it in somewhere in modern Syria. God called him in what is one of the more famous passages in Genesis, which is saying something because a lot of Genesis is famous. But in chapter 12, it begins, the Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who treat you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this is the call of Abram, right? God just speaks to Abram. He's somewhere to the east, either in Syria, maybe Iran. It's hard to know exactly. But God calls him and says, you're just going to follow wherever I tell you to go. And if you do that, I'm going to bless you. And Abram said, okay, and he just left. So verse 9, by faith he stayed as a foreigner in the land of promise, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, co-heirs of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So he's connecting the wanderings of Abram with the future messianic promise, which is an interesting connection, but it's easy to see where he's making that. Abraham was willing to wander all over Canaan, living in tents, living as a sojourner, an alien, a foreigner, and enduring whatever came along that way because he had faith that God was going to fulfill his promises. And we're going to talk about the fulfillment of those promises and the fact that he never saw them as well. So then in verse 11, we get to another really fun verse. By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. This has a lot of verses. This has a lot of problems. So first off, we were talking about Abraham, and now we've shifted over to Sarah. and we're going to go back to Abraham. So why are we talking about Sarah all of a sudden? There is the traditional interpretation, which is that this verse is actually referring to Abraham. And when it says by faith, see, my translation has to confirm it for you, so that, because we don't want to ask questions and you don't want to think for yourselves. It goes, by faith, it's referring to Abraham's faith. By Abraham's faith, by his faith, Sarah was able to have children. So this is a confirmation of Abraham's faith. And that it's not really talking about Sarah. It's admitting what happened through her, but it's really about Abraham. That's option one. Then there's option two. I'll call it the feminist interpretation because that's the most appropriate label. I don't mean anything by it. In this case, Sarah is now the subject. Talking by faith, we mean her faith. By her faith, she was able to conceive and have children. This is very popular today among translators and commentaries. I think because it's nice to have a woman in the Heroes of Faith list, and they don't want to seem like sexist and say it's not talking about Sarah. But this does create problems for us, contextually, for one thing, because when we go back to the Old Testament, it doesn't seem like Sarah has a whole lot of faith. Right? When God first tells Abraham that he's going to have a son, she's the one that laughs, and the angel has to ridicule her. He's like, you're going to have a kid. You'll be pregnant this time next year. And she's like, yeah, right. Also, it's Sarah's idea to have a kid with Hagar, which did not go over very well. So it's hard to attribute this faith status to Sarah based on what we have in the Old Testament. Now, the way that the commentaries get around this, which also seems kind of sexist to me, but I don't know, I'm not an elderly woman, is that her faith was demonstrated or proven. Again, they're not going to say it this way, but this is basically what they're saying. That in order for her to be pregnant, she had to have had sex. And because she's an older woman and barren and past her prime, just the fact of having sex would have been proof of her faith. The only reason why she would have had sex is if she wanted to get pregnant. Because women only have sex to get pregnant, I guess. And elderly women don't just have sex. It seems kind of like a sexist assumption to make, in my opinion. But that's kind of the assumption that they're making, that just willing to be with Abraham was proof of her faith. I'm not sure I buy that argument or I buy that assumption, but again, what do I know? We'll call it a compromising position drawing blank on what the word is, the compromise, is that the faith is referring to Abraham. It's Abraham's faith, but we take Sarah. I don't fully understand the grammatical argument, and I'm not going to try and pretend it, and you don't care what it is. But Sarah becomes, it's like a dative of empowerment or whatever, that Abraham's faith was manifested through her, and the idea is that they are working together in the fulfillment of this faith. I'm not entirely sure which one of these is right, and I'm not going to pretend. But it is a problem in terms of just interpretation. Because when we get to verse 12, we come back to the idea of therefore from one man. So we're back to talking about Abraham. And it seems like that's what we've been talking about all along. So if Sarah is the subject of verse 11, it's an odd detour to make, to include her. From one man, and then we go on, because we don't want to just offend the women, we want to offend the men too. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead. Because, you see, if you are impotent or had a vasectomy or just can't have kids, you are no better off than the dead. So, therefore, from one man, in fact, one as good as dead, came offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as innumerable as the grains of sand by the seashore. I do appreciate the qualification that both stars and sand are describing quantity and not quality. That's a whole can of worms argument that I had someone that I went to school with, and he was obsessed with the idea that sand is referring to quantity. Your descendants will be as numerous as the sand, but stars were referring to quality. Stars referring to divinity. So your descendants would be both numerous and divine. It's a weird argument, and it's really hard to prove, and you have passages like this that just kind of blow it apart, but anyway, he was obsessed with it. So in verse 13, these all died in faith without receiving the promises. Abraham, as the prime example, of course, did not live long enough to see his descendants multiply as God promised. In this sense, he never saw the full realization of his faith, but he died still believing that what he believed would eventually come to pass. All right, so he died in faith, but he never actually saw the promises. So going on. But they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents on the earth. Now, those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they were thinking about where they came from, they would have had an opportunity to return. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So the author of Hebrews is going off a little bit. I think that the point he's trying to make is that he is uniting all of these heroes of the faith, and their belief in God automatically puts them in contrast with the world and the way the world operates. So to continue the metaphor, because they have faith, they don't quite feel at home, and they're not willing to do as the world dictates. And because of that, they then follow God, believing and hoping that they will find a place that they'll be comfortable and that they can call home. And they died in that belief, right? That this world isn't quite right for them. And this fits with some of the arguments he's been making thus far about how this isn't really the real world's going to be in heaven, and it kind of blends all of this together. So in verse 17, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Of course, this is referring to the binding of Isaac, and is one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament. He goes on, he received the promise, and he was offering his unique son. My translation has unique. Others may say only. This is the same word used in John 3:16, the only begotten son. My translation, I think, uses unique instead of only because only is a problem, because Abraham had other sons, right? He had Isaac, he had Ishmael, and then he had the others that we never think about or talk about, because he had more than two sons, right? But this idea, in this case, the word unique or only is probably referring to the true son, the true heir, the one who will continue the legacy and inherit the promise of Abraham. So then verse 18. The one it had been said about, your seed will be traced through Isaac. So here we're kind of hammering the point, right? The promise of Abraham, or the promise to Abraham, will go through Isaac and not Ishmael or any of the other kids. So then verse 19. He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. And here we get a very interesting clarification and interpretation of the Old Testament. This is a fascinating little addition. The author of Hebrews is arguing, just coming out and saying, that Abraham was going to kill Isaac. And he was going to kill Isaac because he has such absolute faith in God. So God had already said that Isaac would be the promised son. And he also told Abraham to kill Isaac. This creates a paradox, right? Isaac is the one who's going to produce offspring and is going to continue the line of Abraham, but then he has to be killed, right? Abraham's going to kill him. So the only way that Abraham could reconcile this conundrum is that he would kill Isaac, and then God would have to raise him from the dead. And the author of Hebrews is saying that that's what Abraham was going to do. He was going to kill him, fully believing that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead, which of course doesn't happen in the Old Testament. We know that he's going to plunge the knife into him, and the angel appears. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. You don't need to do it. So then he goes on, and this is just kind of a fun little insertion. And as an illustration, he received him back. And the only way that I can take this is the illustration is almost like the whole reason why God set this up is so that it could be a picture, an illustration of what would happen in the future. And of course, he doesn't say it out here, but it seems like it's such an obvious nod that this is supposed to be what God would do with Jesus, right? He sets up Abraham to kill the promised son, but doesn't make him go through with it. so that we would see this actually played out in the future with God offering his only son, even connecting the terms, right? The only begotten with John 3:16 and now with Isaac. So it seems like he's very indirectly connecting these two images, even though Jesus isn't mentioned in this verse. So then, verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Now, this is really interesting. Most of these verses are interesting because it doesn't say what I thought it said when I first kind of was reading through this, and maybe some of you also misread it or misheard me. It does not say, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau, but that he blessed both Jacob and Esau, which is really, really interesting. Because again, when I first read it, my presuppositions kicked in. I'm thinking through the story, and the story's rather straightforward and also kind of depressing. Now, you've got the rivalry between the twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older son. He's the one who's supposed to receive the blessing and the inheritance and all of that. And Jacob is a rapscallion. He's a horrible, terrible, no-good person with almost no redeeming qualities. He's just awful. Whereas Esau is actually presented as a fairly noble person, despite the fact that Christian tradition has really tried to paint him as a negative character, deserving of Jacob's trickery, which it never actually does present him that way. In fact, Esau is the one who forgives Jacob, which is one of the greatest demonstrations of love in the Old Testament. It really is. I love the Jacob and Esau story, mainly for Esau. But in all of this, right, Jacob tricks his father to give him Esau's blessing. And his mother's in on it, right? So, again, what I would have expected him to say, and you could, I guess, make it work, is that by faith, Isaac, as a way of explaining the story, by faith, Isaac let Jacob do this. That Jacob was in on the trick. Like, he knew this is what needed to happen. Like, God had revealed to him that Isaac was the one, or that Jacob was the one who needed the blessing. That's not what he says. He says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. And the way I take this is that Jacob, after realizing he had been tricked, the next thing he does is he blesses Esau. And it seems like what the author of Hebrews is saying is that Isaac's faith is accepting that, yes, he had been tricked, but he blessed both sons, and he has faith that God's will still prevail. That is his faith. He has blessed both kids, and he is just going to trust that it's all going to work out, that God is going to use this, and that by blessing one son over the other, that this is somehow part of God's plan. Even if Jacob, right, has done this through nefarious means, and maybe this wasn't the way it was supposed to play out originally, that this is still for the best. I think it's really interesting the way it's worded, and to include Esau as part of the blessing, and that even in blessing Esau, Isaac is showing faith. Because again, we wouldn't expect it to word it that way. It's not, and the way he's wording some of these others, we would expect it something more like how I originally stated. But we go on. Verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. This is pretty straightforward. He blessed the kids. There wasn't really any major drama, although we do see Joseph, right? He has both of his kids, because it does mention Joseph. He's blessing all of the kids, and he wants to bless Joseph twice. And so instead of blessing Joseph, he blesses Joseph's two kids, and he blesses the younger first over the older, and that annoys Joseph. But of course, this could very well be Jacob continuing what happened to him, wanting to exalt the younger over the older. But then in 22, by faith, Joseph, as he was nearing the end of his life, mentioned the exodus of the Israelites and gave instructions concerning his bones. So this is from Genesis 50. I'll read it briefly. Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. You may go, why? What is he talking about? Well, Joseph was one of the younger brothers, and it may very well be that he's the last one alive. And it's possible that all the other brothers have been already taken back to Canaan. They got the family tomb. So he's the last one. There's no one left to bury him. There's no one left to take him to Canaan. And he doesn't want to stay here. He doesn't want to stay in Egypt. He wants to be buried with the rest of his family, be with his father and his brothers. And so he has to have faith, right? First of all, that he has to have faith that the Israelites, the Hebrews, are not going to stay in Egypt. Now, his body is going to be with them until they leave. But he's making a prophecy, he's blessing the people and making a prophecy that you're going to leave, and when you leave, I'm going with you, because I'm not going to stay here. And of course, there's even a little addendum, there's a little note, as they're leaving Egypt, they carry the casket of Joseph with them. So he leaves Egypt. And this assumption is that he's buried eventually. Of course, I don't think it ever mentions him being buried, but we assume that happens. So then, verse 23. By faith, after Moses was born, he was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they didn't fear the king's edict. This is an odd way of saying it, because the way I read the story, they were kind of afraid. They're hiding him in cupboards and baskets and whatever, and I would expect them to say, by faith, they took their baby, a couple months old or however old he is, and then they put him in a basket and set him in the river. That takes a lot of faith. Just leave your kid in a basket and have it drift off down the river. He doesn't. He just says by faith they were hiding the kid and that they weren't afraid. I don't know why he says it this way or why he words it this way, but this is what he says. And then he goes on, 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. This is almost certainly based on Jewish tradition. We don't get a whole lot of this in the Old Testament. There's that movie, The Prince of Egypt, right, where Moses is raised as one of the royal family. I'm not entirely sure if that's the most accurate description. Moses more likely was Moses was most likely an example of, and we see this with other empires, with other countries, you're occupying a non-native group. And if all you do is set your own people over them, well, then they see their oppressors as other than themselves, and then they want to rebel. So here's what you do. If you're a savvy empire, you take the best and brightest of the people you're oppressing, and you indoctrinate them. You raise them up in your schools. You give them your lifestyle. You convert them to your way of life, and then you elevate them as masters over their own people. And that way, when the slaves or whatever look to the people that are ruling them, they see their own. And they're less likely to rebel against their own. We see this with like Daniel and his friends. There's a reason why they're being taken off to Babylon and indoctrinated in the Babylonian culture. And we see this over and over again. So that's more likely what it is. And now that's not to say that Moses was not raised with the Egyptian elite, but the idea that he was treated as royalty, I'm not sure the Old Testament ever confirms that. But I'm not contradicting the book of Hebrews. So then verse 25. And to choose to suffer with the people of God rather than to enjoy the short-lived pleasure of sin. For he considered the reproach because of the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since his attention was on the reward. I have no idea where he's getting this from. There's really no mention of Messiah in the Moses narrative. And there's not a whole lot of discussion about why that he rejected the treasures and pleasures of Egypt because of his faith or whatever. And we're going to get to verse 27. So in verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the king's anger, for Moses persevered as one who sees what is invisible. This straight up seems to contradict the book of Exodus. And I'll read you briefly. Exodus 2, verse 14. This is when you have the Hebrews that are arguing in front of Moses, and one of them goes, "Who made you a leader and judge over us?" Man replied, "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Remember, Moses is a murderer. Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is now known." When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. It sounds like the reason why Moses got out of Dodge is because he had murdered someone. It had become known that he had murdered someone, and now the Pharaoh was looking for his head, and Moses fled out of fear. That's not what the author of Hebrews says, and I don't have an easy way to explain this discrepancy. David Allen, in his commentary, even wrote, which is just funny, the events narrated in 11:24-26 find no parallel in the Exodus narrative. That's a pretty blatant statement. And as we're going to see, the author of Hebrews is also going to take other liberties with some of the Old Testament stories, which we will kind of briefly allude to. So in verse 28, by faith he instituted the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. So yes, this is absolutely. You had the first Passover, they had the Passover meal, they took the blood, put it on the door frame, and all of that demonstrations of faith. Verse 29, by faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. You know what's missing, right? This is something that we do, and it's done in good, with a good tradition. We tend to focus on the positives, and we kind of ignore what comes after. So there's the Passover, there's the Red Sea, all that's good stuff, but we don't really talk about what happens after the Red Sea, because it's kind of all downhill after the Red Sea. And we'll get some of that. So then verse 30, by faith the walls of Jericho fell down after being encircled by the Israelites for 7 days. Yes, absolutely. This is one of Joshua's great victories. Verse 31, by faith Rahab the prostitute received the spies in peace and didn't perish with those who disobeyed. This is a great addition, and we have a woman now as one of the heroes of faith. And again, something is missing. What is missing is the fact that she's the grandmother of David. Well, one of the ancestors of David, and part of the Christ genealogy. You would think that would deserve a nod, but for whatever reason. And then he goes, and what more can I say, for time is too short? Now, I don't know what you think of the man, but this sounds almost like a Trump sort of statement. Like, I want to say more, but I can't. I want to tell you about all the other heroes, but I don't have time. They're great heroes. They're so great. They did great things, but I don't have time, so don't make me. I want to tell you about Gideon and Barak, but I don't have time. I'm not going to do it. I want to tell you about how they were spared from the sword and how they did this and how they did that, but I don't have time, so don't make me. It sounds almost Trumpian to me when he does this. So in verse 32, what more can I say, for time is short? And then he goes on and says it anyway. For me to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms. Like he doesn't stop. Who by faith conquered kingdoms. It's hard to know who this is referring to, if anyone specifically. It might be Joshua or one of the other judges. Not too many people in Israel's history are known as conquerors of kingdoms. Joshua is probably one of the better examples of it. But then he goes on, administer justice. This could be almost any king, but maybe Samuel specifically, because he was called to judge Eli as well as Saul. Obtained promises. This could refer to Abraham, could refer to Moses, could refer to David. Shut the mouths of lions. I mean, come on, we know who that is, right? That's Daniel. Pretty much has to be Daniel. Quenched the raging of fire. This is probably referring to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Escaped the edge of the sword. This could be a lot of people, like Elijah. Gained strength after being weak. And now we have Samson. Oh, boy. If there was ever a line in the New Testament that makes me question the validity of the New Testament, it might be this one. I cannot think of Samson as a hero of the faith. It's so incredible. But then we became mighty in battle. That seems like it's referring to Gideon, actually. Gideon the coward, Gideon the one, hiding out from the armies, and then almost overnight becoming this great warrior and hero of Israel. Put foreign armies to flight. This could be a bunch of people, but he already mentioned Barak, who was a coward, who didn't actually lead the troops, but here he is being mentioned. It was Deborah. It was a woman who actually led the troops, or not led the troops necessarily, but she was the one who actually gave the signal to start the battle. Because, again, Barak was too cowardly to do it. Verse 35, women received their dead. They were raised to life again. This could be referring to both Elijah and Elisha. Elijah raised the widow's son. Elisha raised the Shunammite woman's son. Some were tortured, not accepting release, so that they might gain a better resurrection. The commentary seem to be unanimous that this is referring to Jeremiah. And so I said at the beginning that this chapter creates a few contextual and theological dilemmas for us. And it's a weird paradox, because in the New Testament, we love to talk about the ones who start really badly, but end really strong. So we love talking about Peter and Paul. Peter rejects Christ, dies him 3 times. Paul, was a persecutor of the faith, and then both of them become pillars of the Christian church. In fact, pretty much everybody at the beginning starts badly, and almost everyone mentioned in Acts and even in the Gospels at some point are martyred, if you go with the Catholic traditions. Very few are not martyred, John being a good example of this. But when it comes to the Old Testament, we love talking about characters who either start well or have moments of brilliance, and then we conveniently ignore what happens afterwards, because most of them end badly. So, for example, we've got people who start bad and end bad. There's the obvious examples like Cain, Saul, Ahab. But here he actually mentions people like Barak, who was a coward, who it even says, Deborah says to him, if I go to battle with you, you will not get honor for this. And he goes, fine, I don't care. Come with me. You have Jephthah, who killed his own daughter, and I'm convinced that he actually killed her. And you have Samson, who it says who the Bible actually says was worse of an oppressor than the Philistines. I mean, how's that of an indictment? And yet he lists Barak, Jephthah, and Samson all as heroes of faith. Now you have some who start really well, but end not well. Noah is a big example of this. Abraham, I'm going to kind of include because his end is not as shining as we would like. You've got Moses, obviously. Moses, who doesn't even get to go into the promised land because of his disobedience. You have Gideon, you have David, even Hezekiah. Again, all characters who start off pretty well and yet kind of peter out or just plummet at the end. And then you have characters who start well and end well. And he makes quite a few allusions to these. So you have Joshua. There's hardly a negative thing mentioned of Joshua. You have Samuel. You have Elijah, Daniel, Esther, all of which there's really not a single complaint against any of them. But then you have a category that's hardly ever talked about when it comes to the Old Testament, and that is the category we love in the New Testament, those who start badly but end well. The best example of this is Jacob, who is a horrible, no-good, rotten person, and yet ends up being a pretty godly person, although it takes, he has to be broken by he has to meet someone who's even more conniving than he is with Laban and be, pretty much abused for 7 to 14 years of his life. And then he has to meet his older brother Esau at the end of his life, who he has treated so horribly to be forgiven by Esau, which is one of my favorite episodes in the whole Old Testament. And it's like after Esau forgives him, like you can almost see this psychological change. Like he has like a mental breakdown after that. And he's a completely different person after that. So Jacob, one of the best examples of someone who starts badly and ends well. But there's another character who you probably don't know who starts off really badly and ends well. And he's an anomaly. And even the Bible doesn't really know what to do with him. That's the king Manasseh, who it says when he starts off was no better than the evil kings, right? He followed after the idols. He followed after the ways of the evil kings. But then about halfway through, he has a conversion. He has like this moment where he realizes, oh, I've been wrong, and he goes through he has a conversion moment. And the rest of his life is he tries to kind of undo all that he'd done in his earlier life. So he's pretty much the only king of Israel that we can say started evil and actually ends godly. So, what does all this mean? Well, I think it brings us back to Jesus' quote about the mustard seed, and I think this helps give us some insight into what the purpose of all these names are. This is not just a historical recap of these characters from the Old Testament that you should more or less be aware of, and associating them with these great bouts of faith that some of them may be a bit idealized or exaggerated, at least from the Old Testament accounts. Some of these individuals are very much defined by their faith, such as Abraham, Moses, David, and despite being defined by their faith, they are deeply flawed individuals. Abraham was a habitual liar, Moses was a murderer, and David, oh my goodness, David was a horrible, horrible person that you would not want to be ruled by. But then you also have people like Joseph, Samuel, and Daniel, who were also men of faith with no actual mentioned flaws. But then you have individuals who are not presented as men of faith, they're not defined by their faith, and yet are able to produce these moments of faith that God is able to use. And the biggest examples of this are, of course, Barak, Jephthah, and Samson. I'm kind of on the fence with Gideon, to put them in that category. They're all actually presented fairly negatively, and yet because of these bursts of faith, God is able to use them despite their flaws. And I think that this goes with, because again, this is all filtered, or this is all building from his initial argument, which is we are to be, because remember, at the beginning of the chapter, and even before in chapter 10, he's talking to an audience, encouraging them to continue in the faith. He's giving them reasons why you need to persevere in the faith. And the whole point of this sort of recap is to explain what has been done through faith. And this isn't necessarily a justification of all these individuals, although we're going to get an interesting statement. So in verse 36, others experienced mockings and scourgings as well as bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they died by the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins, goatskins, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. Yes, truly, the world was not worthy of Samson. I think the world might deserve better than Samson. They wandered in deserts and on mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these were approved through their faith, but they did not receive what was promised. So they all at some point put their trust in Yahweh, but they never saw the fulfillment of his plans. They never got to see the big picture. They never got to see all of this unfurled to its fullest, even going back to Abraham and so forth. Verse 40, since God had provided something better for us. He's managed to take all of this detour, and he's now bringing us back to the theme of the book, which is something better has come. So all of these people, their faith was in God, and that something was coming, right? That their faith would be rewarded. That somehow all of this would come together in a meaningful way, but they couldn't comprehend it, they couldn't see it. But now that something better has come. So then he goes on. So since God had provided something better for us, so that they would not be made perfect without us. God wouldn't give them the final vision or whatever because it was going to happen all at once. Now we're all sharing in that together. And that's chapter 11.
Thank you, brother. That gives you a lot to think about. Brother Randall, would you close us in prayer tonight?